I've rotated the engine now to top dead center, and I've left the rotor on as there was something I wanted to share with you earlier on, a caution, and I forgot to do it. I just reminded myself, you need to keep your fingers out of the inside of the rotor because there's a really sharp edge. It's razor sharp inside there, and if you stick your thumb in here and go to turn the rotor or pull it off, you have a good chance of cutting yourself like I did. And you don't want to do that because you get blood all over your tools and they'll rust. Anyway, this thing is at top dead center, and you can see the counterbalance is now in the bottom dead center, and so it can't have any influence over tensioning the chain or anything like that. And well, that's why I like to do it, and it adds 2 or 3 or 4 minutes to your adjustment time, so I think it's well worth it. Now to the question of how can I tell if my bike has an aftermarket doohickey in it. There are really 3 ways to tell. One is that the aftermarket doohickey is clocked a little bit differently than the stock one is. So when it sits in the engine, it will appear to have, if the bolt is usually right here, it will appear to have a lot of adjustment range left. It's also got a slightly longer arc of slot here than the stock one does. These 2 things are kind of difficult to tell when you're peering into the engine trying to see this thing, because really I'll show you what you can see, and later on in the video when we put it all back together I'll get the camera down at an angle where you can really see what you're going to be looking at, but I'll simulate it here. Hang on a second. This is what you'll be able to see. So it's going to be kind of hard to tell if it looks like it's got a longer slot or if it's clocked a little bit differently than a stock one would be. So we're down to the 3rd characteristic, and that is the surface finish of the aftermarket part versus the factory part. The factory part is an investment cast piece that's been cleaned up quite a bit, and so it has a smooth, dull, matte finish to it, whereas the aftermarket part has been machined out of a hunk of metal, and the front side of it here has been Blanchard ground, and so you will see grinding marks across the face, and it will also be rather shiny. So if you look in there and you can see these grinding marks across the outer face, and it looks a little bit shiny, then very, very likely, in fact 100%, you've got an aftermarket doohickey in there. And of course you would also be able to see the torsion spring locked into place on the doohickey, unless of course the previous owner had installed an extension spring in, and of course in that case you wouldn't see any spring. But this is a dead giveaway for sure if the torsion spring is visible. And it could be hard to see, because if you look back half a minute or so, you could see how much you can really see, but you can go in there with a little probe and see if you can catch on it. But those are the 3 characteristics of the aftermarket doohickey versus the stock doohickey, and then the dead giveaway if you have a torsion spring. Got 2 things to show you here. If you're going to install the torsion spring, which I highly recommend because it's do it once and get it over with, never have to come back again, unless you're like me and you like to play, you're going to have to drill a hole in the inner case. This is the proper place to drill the hole. I believe the instructions say at about 5:30. A long time ago, originally I think, the instructions said to drill the hole at 7:30. And so I drilled the hole at about, I guess that's about 7:30. And the spring was impossible to put in, and so I said to myself, drill a hole someplace else. And so I drilled it back over at 5:30, and everything went just fine. So you want to make sure that you drill that hole at the 5:30 position just about so, just so it's getting close onto the radius there, and everything should install just fine. The second thing I've done here is I've cleaned up this surface a little bit. Not going to go in and mill it flat or anything like that, but I've taken some emery cloth and scrubbed the area just to remove any sharp burrs or anything that could contribute to the doohickey hanging up. Just cleaned it up a little bit is all. And hopefully that will help some. I know it's going to, all I'm interested in doing is making sure there are no burrs or sharp edges that will hang up the doohickey. I've got my gasket surface prepped. It's all clean down to bare metal. I've made sure that I haven't swept any gasket material into the bolt holes, and I've wiped it down with a solvent. There are two locating dowels on the crankcase. One's down here and one's up here. These things will oftentimes come out when you pull the inner case, and they will stick in the inner case. And you want to put them back in the crankcase because it's a handy way to hang your gasket, and it's a lot easier to put this together if the gasket is on the engine side of things or the bike side of things than it is if it's on the inner case side. There's nothing special about putting the case on. You just want to hang it over the starter motor nose and get it onto the idler shaft and onto the locating dowels, and then you just sort of gently tap it into place over those 4 points, and when you hit it and it doesn't shake or rattle, you're done. Okay, now we're ready to just put the bolts in. The first bolt that I like to put in is the bolt that I stuck on a card, and that way I make sure I get it in there. It's also a little bit shorter than all the rest of them, so we don't get it confused with other bolts and then try and put a long bolt in here, which won't work. So I'm going to go ahead and put these bolts all in, and I'll be back once I've got that done. Okay, I'm just torquing the last bolt here, and I'm ready to move on to installing the doohickey. First on is the torsion spring, and stick that in the little hole you drilled, and then put the doohickey on. Now I want to install the bolt with the washer, and the reason that the aftermarket kit comes with a washer is the aftermarket doohickey is that much thinner than the stock doohickey, so the purpose of the washer is to take up space. And I'm going to install the bolts, and I'm going to push the lever this way in the tightening direction as much as I possibly can and tighten the bolt down. And the reason I want to do that is in order to put the spring in, I don't want the doohickey flopping around, and I'd like to have that portion of the doohickey as far over towards where the spring has to hook into as I possibly can. So I'm just going to snug that down. So I've got everything pushed in that direction, and I'm going to have to pull this spring around and hook it on.